In just 5 months of pontificate, Pope Leo XIV moved from a style of disarming sobriety to a series of signals that made the most attentive faithful tremble. Surprising appointments, ambiguous words, symbolic gestures that have divided the Church and left open a disturbing question. Where is this pontificate really going? Today, we retrace the 5 most controversial moves that have sparked controversy throughout the Catholic world and reveal the face of a Church now in complete confusion. Since the first months of his pontificate, Pope Leo XIV has signed a series of appointments that, rather than reassuring, have raised more than a few eyebrows in the traditionalist Catholic world. The common thread in these choices is the often declared progressive orientation that seems to want to give the Curia and the cultural bodies of the Holy See a more inclusive direction, and for some, less anchored to doctrinal tradition. The first shock came with the appointment of Cristiana Perella to lead the Accademia dei Virtuosi al Pantheon. His arrival at an institution historically linked to the Church's artistic patronage was interpreted by many observers as the signal of a cultural shift that prioritizes aesthetic modernity over the spiritual dimension of art. But it was no exception. In the liturgical and disciplinary fields, the confirmation of Cardinal Arthur Roche as prefect of the Dicastery for Divine Worship and the discipline of the sacraments irritated many conservative circles. Roche, known for his restrictive stance on the Latin Mass and his rigorous application of Francis's motu proprio traditionis custodes, is considered a symbol of continuity with the previous season. His permanence in such a sensitive role has been interpreted as a clear signal. The new pontiff does not intend to reopen the liturgical front to concessions towards the ancient rite. Other appointments have consolidated the impression of a progressive shift to the left in the geography of Vatican power. The arrival of Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich, a Luxembourg Jesuit and leading figure in the Synod on Synodality, as an informal theological advisor, and the growing influence of Cardinal Matteo Zuppi seem to indicate a convergence between the leaders of the new pontificate and the more progressive elements of the episcopate. Even the academic and cultural front has not been immune to surprises. Some internal sources report that in the coming months, prominent members of the pontifical academies will be replaced with profiles more in dialogue with contemporary times. Translated, fewer dogmatic theologians and more experts in the environment, society, and communications. Point 2. When the case of Senator Dick Durbin, a prominent figure in the Democratic Party and a symbol of that social policy so dear to certain progressive circles, exploded again in the United States, Leo XIV intervened with words that left many Catholics speechless. He invited us to look at the politician's public life as a whole, almost as if to suggest that civic and humanitarian commitment could compensate for other choices that remain in stark contrast with Christian teaching. But this very approach, based on so-called selective morality, soon backfired, because morality, as theologians have always reminded us, is not a sum of balances, but a consistent choice. Either you're moral or you're not. There's no middle ground for justification. Selectivity ultimately was seen only by the Pope, a way to distribute blame and dilute personal responsibility behind the complexity of the modern world. Thus, instead of strengthening the moral credibility of the pontificate, the speech gave the opposite impression. It showed a pope attentive to political sensibilities but uncertain about the extent of his judgment. The Durban episode thus remains an emblem of this season. A church that speaks a lot about coherence, but risks losing it the moment it redraws its boundaries. In one of his first public interviews after his election, Leo XIV wanted to make a point. There is currently no room for liturgical blessings of same-sex couples, nor for the recognition of the female diaconate. He made a clear distinction between pastoral acceptance and doctrinal change, establishing that one can never overcome the other. This stance was greeted with relief by those who fear a surrender to the dictates of the world, but it also fueled recriminations. According to some critics, reiterating the "no so soon" suggests a strategic choice, not a considered conviction. That the party wants to buy time, establishing itself as a moderate while maintaining control. Anyone listening may be left with the suspicion that, under sufficient pressure, that there is no margin for error could become "will decide" in the future. Thus, this declaration represents for now both a warning and a tense boundary, a boundary that the modern world will closely monitor, waiting to see if the Church will truly be able to resist the advance of cultural demands. Point 4. It only took one day to unleash a storm. In the heart of Rome during the Jubilee, a rainbow march took place, billed as a pilgrimage of inclusion and welcomed without restriction by the Vatican authorities. The images of the participants, welcomed in procession and received like an ordinary group of pilgrims, went around the world and sparked the immediate reaction of numerous bishops and priests. Many prelates have expressed deep indignation, speaking openly of moral confusion and outrage against the decorum of the holy place. Some have pointed out that pastoral welcome can never be transformed into symbolic approval of something that contradicts natural and divine law. The absence of a clear signal from the Holy See has been deemed an even more serious wound than the event itself. Several prominent bishops and cardinals have publicly asked Leo XIV for a solemn act of reparation to restore the honor of the place and give a sign of clarity to the world. But the Pope, although informed of the requests, made no official gesture, limiting himself to a generic appeal for dialogue and listening. Faced with silence, some dioceses have organized a public act of reparation, celebrated in churches and chapels, to ask God's forgiveness for the offense inflicted on the heart of Christianity. A simple yet eloquent gesture which gave voice to that segment of the Catholic population that refuses to resign itself to silence or the confusion of signs. Point 5. At Castel Gandolfo, during the Raising Hope conference, Leo XIV made a gesture that sparked discussion. He blessed a fragment of ice from Greenland, presented as a symbol of care for creation and the environmental fragility of the planet. A simple but highly publicized gesture, in line with the ecological awareness promoted by Laudato Si', which, however, left many faithful perplexed. For many observers, the scene had the feel of a spectacular spirituality, closer to symbolic activism than prayer. Blessing a block of ice, however charged with environmental significance, struck many as a way of bending sacred language to worldly rhetoric. Some saw in that act a sign of continuity with Francis, and others, on the contrary, a signal of how the Church now seems more concerned with communicating to the world than with speaking to heaven. In a few images, Castel Gandolfo offered a portrait of the new pontificate. Thoughtful gestures, global messages, and a religiosity that risks melting like that blessed ice in the heat of consensus. What do you think? If you liked the video, comment Amen. God bless you.